do they have to float, or do they just have to be accessible in high water? So I'm just thinking a lot about, you know, what are precedents for floating gardens and floating beds historically, and one of the challenges that I'm thinking of is that like most of those are in fresh water, where the water has the ability for the roots of plants to interact with them and actually like become part of a growing system. And so if we're looking at the mechanisms for floating beds, like Victorian floating bed, like any ancient sort of floating bed, which there are a lot of models of, those are all going to be, at least in my conception, certainly there are things you don't know that you don't know, and I didn't like go to a library about this, but those are all going to be freshwater beds. But I think that the mechanisms for those beds in terms of holding the weight of the soil are going to be important to look at. So looking back at what's worked in the past, and I think the place where looking at those models are going to fail is that our root systems are not going to be able to go into this water. And not only are they not going to be able to grow into the water, they're going to need to be protected from the water at all costs. I think one of the key challenges here is that a bed needs really good drainage. In South Louisiana, we are going to, that's going to be like the number one thing, right? The flooding is going to be the violent incident that happens every now and then. The drought is going to be the thing that happens every now and then. But what we're going to have a lot of the time is these really heavy rains, and those rains, if we don't have permeability in the bed or good drainage in the bed, it's going to flood within the bed, and that's just going to kill stuff. Even if we have poor drainage at the bottom of the bed and there's not like enough movement of water over the years, the leaching of things that are building up in that bed isn't going to happen appropriately. So you might be like, oh good, it shouldn't drain too much because then we have some moisture retention at the bottom, and I hear that. But there's this issue with like, stuff is going to trickle up and down the soil profile if it's all sitting down there. If there's like gnarly soil bacteria that's starting to get kind of anaerobic down there because it's got a little bit of water sitting all the time, that's going to lead to root rots in the bed. Maybe not this year, but maybe the next year. And I think the last thing any of us want is like sustainable design solutions that are actually like 5 years down the road we're all like, oh, this is disgusting, and now we have to find a way to put it in a dumpster, right? So a really, really good level of drainage, and then balancing that with the intrusion of floodwaters, which are going to have different levels of saline every time. But what I want designers to understand is like root contact with salt water, except for maybe some of these natives that are used to being in coastal areas, is going to be like immediate fatality for most domesticated plants and a lot of natives and a lot of medicinals. And that salt water coming into contact with the plant, just in case anyone's like, okay, well, then replant, that is going to sit in the soil. There are selective barriers. Like this is not a talent of my own, but like, you know, salt is a particle, and it has an ability to move through an osmotic barrier depending on the balance of salt, you know, on either side of it. So that's just, there's something to consider about like the systems that we see in nature, for our bodies to regulate salt, for our bodies to regulate water within them, and I don't know if those are adaptable to large-scale design or industrial design, but I think that that's an interesting path of inquiry. The parameters of a bed that is designed are going to dictate what can be done in that bed. So some beds are going to be, they're going to have the root depth of being able to produce like those heavy fruiting plants. So for instance, like you might be able to produce like lettuces and greens on a pretty shallow root depth, because most of what's happening there is happening above ground. But if you want to grow eggplants, if you want to grow tomatoes, if you want to grow chayote, if you want to grow carrots, like those things are going to require deeper soil profile, and they're also going to be more calorie dense, they're going to be more hardy and more filling. So it's really about like what is the goal, and then what is the space that's being provided both in width, but also like width and length, but also in depth. So we can't give like a pounds number, especially because medicinals are part of this and natives are part of this project as well. But what I can say is the most adaptable spaces are going to be the best and the most prolific for any kind of use. So if we can get like a good root profile on a planter, that means it can be used for natives, it can be used for medicinals, it can be used for food producing crops. If we can get, you know, a nice width, the bigger a bed is, that can still float and still has a root depth, the better it's going to be. But then you got to bring in the thought about like, how does someone access it when it's flooded? Can it hold the weight of a human body to walk across the bare surface of a planter box? Is that a safe endeavor? Do we have the liability to say, yeah, go ahead and walk across it when it's basically a boat? So those are design considerations that I don't have the skills. I'm not the designer, I'm the grower. But I would say, you know, as wide and as long and as deep as someone can safely make this and reasonably make this is gonna be the best case scenario for production. And I also, when we're talking about those parameters, I want people to think about like the ergonomics of accessing a bed. So, you know, how long is the average forearm of a person, and so how deep are they leaning into a bed? Can they access it from both sides so that it can be like two of the lengths of a human arm? You know, and then is that the maximum on all sides if it can't be accessed when it's floating, or is there something I haven't thought of where it can be accessed when it's floating? So I know that I'm giving people more questions than answers, but you know, growing food in harmony with medicinals and natives, there's not a pat answer. I think it's fine to go with 12 inches, but for a healthy plant that's going to be able to, you know, go through a drought, which is going to happen in this state, and heavy rains, and be able to get enough nutrition, I wouldn't go less than 18 inches. And I would consider that like a bare minimum. You know, in a lot of these beds here, they're 24 inches deep, but then they also, you know, roots can go, there's contact with the soil beneath them. And that's a thing that these beds are probably going to lose, right? Because if they have an open bottom that allows for like impermeability in the roots with the native soil, that's not going to work when there's a flood. So we don't really know like the deep impacts of microplastics in soil yet. What I know is like a both and, which is that like they exist and we know they're not good, and that they can be, you know, incorporated into human body from the soil, and that they're everywhere, right? There's microplastics in my blood right now. And so that doesn't, I think there's like a decision that's going to have to be made from each individual designer, like the Venn diagram of what they can actually do with the materials that they're given, because wood's going to rot really quickly. You know, and sealed wood is going to have the same, or like different but similar problems to plastics. Unnaturally sealed wood, naturally sealed wood is going to still rot very quickly. Plastic is going to create microplastics. So it becomes like a menu, like kind of a pick your poison situation, which is what living in our world feels like a lot of the time. But I do think, you know, there's a possibility of someone being able to do something like lightweight in aluminum, and then you have to think about like aluminum reactivity with soil. Basically, yeah, I think this is a situation where we're gonna be able to find a problem with any material that needs to also float. Like on ground, I prefer wood. I greatly prefer wood. I also like some like lightweight metals, great materials for raised beds like rubbers, plastics, all that stuff. Leaches big time, and like I said, we don't really know what that means yet. Liners are going to be plastic, or they're going to be like very quickly biodegradable. We're talking about things that are in direct contact with wet soil constantly. So the like bioplastics are going to degrade incredibly quickly, and there are going to be people in this competition who are designing from other parts of the country, and I like need them to understand how quickly everything degrades in the Louisiana sun. I think like watering cans don't last more than a season here. Like they become like rigid, like plastic immediately, and I think people are like, yeah, it's hot and the sun's bright everywhere, and there's like a misunderstanding of like how intensely the sun degrades plastics here. And I think that if you get a plastic liner because you're worried about something from wood leaching, then you're going to be dealing with plastic. If you get like a burlap liner, it's going to be super permeable, it's going to degrade really quickly. And then in terms of runoff, like I think that soil is healthiest when it's occasionally washed by natural rainwater. City water isn't great for soil. That's why you'll notice that like during droughts, if you're watering from your hose in your yard, stuff will just look less healthy, and that's because there is buildup of, our water's really basic in a lot of parts of Louisiana. It's really acidic in other parts of Louisiana. All of those pH components affect our plants. There's also buildup of like minerals in our water that transfer into the beds. So you really want that pure, like pH neutral rainwater washing through a bed. And I tend to think that's great water to trickle back into the soil profile, but it's not water that you want to save, because what it's doing is it's washing out excess nutrients and minerals, and that's not really something you need to keep. You want it to like go back into a water flowing system. Yeah. A thing that's important to the community is propagation of important natives and medicinals, and I think that having germ beds, like areas where protected germination can happen for things to be bumped up to a bigger size, could absolutely happen in a bed where things were producing as well. So I think there is the ability for a bed to have multifunctionality. It just gets into a place of like, how many things are you trying to get out of one bed, and how light can that bed be and still float? But I think it's definitely possible in a bed that doesn't have to float. So if we can get a bed to float, I don't see why it's not possible in a bed that floats. Does that make sense? Yeah. To me, what sustainable crop cultivation is, and the thing that I've really internalized over the past many years of being a farmer and a gardener and a person who grows food in community, is being able to have a closed cycle with what you produce and what you need on farm, and not feeling like the continuation of growing food requires constant external inputs that you don't have access to. So like what that looks like on a day-to-day basis is like, if gardening for you requires that you are constantly running to a big box store and having to buy a chemical, buy fertilizer, buy nutrients, buy new plants, like any of that doesn't feel sustainable to me financially or environmentally. So from a sustainability perspective, running to the store to buy inputs constantly to keep your garden productive, that's not sovereignty, that's not freedom in your food choice. That's still being really deeply tied into a system. And to garden cultivated plants is going to require some inputs, but I think it's as minimal as those can be and as community controlled as those can be. So that's systems of being able to take healthy plant waste and turn it back into soil. That's systems of being able to seed save in your community and have, the ability to create your own nutrients. Maybe that's by fertilizing with compost tea. Maybe that's by fermenting plant material. It could be by, composting with bugs, like whatever it is that works for any individual community. Mulching with things that you are cutting back from your own garden. So just being able to keep that cycle as closed as possible and build your own soil rather than having to constantly like go buy new soil. Making nutrition within your soil by being able to compost. Those are things that feel like sustainability to me. When you're looking at a raised bed, like I think increasing the diversity of crops that people are growing in that bed is going to increase the diversity of nutrients that they're getting as well. So the things that we try to encourage people to grow, especially in community beds, like shared beds, are the things that have a really high, they're high value in a store, and might be the things that fall out of a grocery budget, but actually are really important to food culture and to community food history. So it's herbs, like fresh herbs. Those are things that in a grocery store it's like $2 for a bundle of herbs. That's ridiculous when we have herbs all throughout outside the fence that people can just come and cut, and that helps with being able to cook and have subsistence in your home and have food taste the way you want it to, taste the way you remember it tasting in your family. We grow militant because we don't want to send people into a grocery store to buy militant or chayote that comes from somewhere else, when we can grow it right here. So there's roselle hibiscus, Thai roselle hibiscus, and then also roselle hibiscuses that are from the islands. So people are able, there's epazote, people are able to really honor their food culture and history, show it to each other, and build on it, but they're not necessarily supplanting their food. Does that make sense? I think a really important thing for people in food sovereignty movements and local food movements to start talking about really openly, because it's it's not helpful for us to not be honest with people as they're like trying to grow their own food. And I'm saying that to designer submission, some folks who are making submissions. I know the community that these beds are for have already figured this out, right? So this is not a secret, is that an individual raised bed is going to be really amazing for supplementing food and nutrition for a family, but it is not going to ever be like financially feasible to offset the cost of eating in America. And I think we have a lot of visions, mostly because of social media influencers, of like having homesteads that completely supplement our family's food, and that is like then free and you're off the grid and you're free from the system, and that's just not actually the reality of growing food in America. Because we've all been so disconnected from the tools that we need, so kind of reconnecting with those things is costly. And that, again, there might be shades of nuance to that with the community that these beds are going into, but by and large, as these designers are thinking about like what is the nutritional impact of a raised bed, you should be conceiving of it as something that that helps on a journey to food sovereignty and doesn't necessarily like replace the nutritional needs of a family. So we're in a community garden right now that has anywhere between 20 and 30 members. This is one of 3 sides of the garden, and everyone works super hard and farms this together, and really, we grow thousands of pounds of food here a year, and it's a supplement, and it's also like a way to build community. It's a way to talk about food. It's a way to share food history, and it's a way to give people power and autonomy over what they eat, but it doesn't replace a grocery bill. And I think people are afraid to say that because it takes some of the power away of a local food movement, but I would counter that like not being real about growing local food is not helpful for a movement either. The way I tend to think about interplanting is more in terms of what like a plant needs, and so you're going to want to plant light feeders next to heavy feeders in terms of nutrients, or plant things that are fixing nitrogen from the air next to things that are heavily feeding off nitrogen from the air. So just be thinking about what the nutritional needs of each plant are, what the part that's requiring the most energy from the plant is, and try to mix those things. So you don't want a tomato right next to an eggplant, not because of some like magical thing you can't see, but because they're both working on the same thing. So they're both taxing the soil in the same way, which is creating a big, shiny, pretty, colorful fruit that takes so much energy out of the soil. So planting things that are scrappier next to things that are prettier is a good way to think about it. In our garden here, you'll see like we have like basil next to a tomato, right? Basil's like pretty easy growing, like quick crop. All it's really taking out of the soil is like a little bit of nutrients and a lot of moisture, and then the tomato is a heavy feeder. So just not mixing those things, like a carrot, a root, that's going to be a heavy feeder if you're going to do a root in any of these raised beds. And then also medicinals can take a little bit more abuse because it leads to a higher concentration of whatever the medicinal property is in the plant. So thinking about the spots of a bed that are going to be the least watered, which if they're being hand watered might be the center. If they're on irrigation, it might be where the irrigation is missing. Those medicinals are going to be better capable of handling drought, of handling heavy rain, of handling hot sun, not because they'll like look beautiful and thrive in those conditions, but because their intended purpose is to exist and be beautiful plants. But like if you are harvesting them for medicine, they will have a higher concentration of those properties if they're stressed. Do your research and make a decision from the most place of power that you can, knowing that there's not a perfect answer, but like you're gonna need to kind of know why you went with what you went with. If you learned one thing from me today, it's that there's not going to be one right answer to anything, and there is not going to be like one perfect bed, because growing in the deep south is imperfect, growing in subtropical conditions is imperfect, and it's going to fail at times. And so what you're trying to do is be the most prepared that you can be and have the most answers that you can, instead of just assuming that like very traditional models of growing work in this situation.